I remember the day as clear as the water in the freshest lake. The day was gloomy, and the clouds were all over, and the day was not what I was expecting it to be. I never wanted to go to the theater that day, but then I had to. No option. I had to go and watch the film anyway. I was on the date with this girl, and she decided that the best place to go with me on the first date would be a film. I think it was the movie Snake on a Plane. I honestly thought it was the weird choice to go on a date and watch snakes on a plane. It's not exactly the kind of film that would get your date excited about you. I was still a bit optimistic knowing that I would see my girl in there. We decided to meet at the mall, and she was looking real beautiful when she arrived. I'd only known her for a month. She was to work the same job as me. I was the manager at the furniture store, and she worked there too. I was really fascinated by her, and I asked her out. She agreed on the condition that she would choose the place, and hence we were here. And she chose a movie, and that too, Snakes on a Plane. I was certain that it wasn't the best choice for a date, but I was still agreed knowing the girl and how she was. She was the girl that I did not want to let go. And then we meet at the AMC theater in the city, and it was a later night show, so there was this feeling that I might get lucky tonight. And she met me, and she already had the tickets and was waiting for me with popcorns and soda. And then when I saw her, I realized I was lucky. I was giddy to be there, and to be on the date with her. We took our seats and sat around and started talking as the trailers were going on, and she kissed me as the movie started. And the movie started, and it was a pretty intense film. When it started and we were having our time, sitting and talking, there wasn't much to talk about. The noise in there were intense. The hall was packed, and there was no way I could get in any kisses or even a decent talk with her there. And on top of that, if it's an interesting movie, you don't really want to talk. And the thing is, I was finding the movie interesting, and I was watching it. I felt something whisk through my legs, and I tried to look what it was, but there was nothing that could be made. So I sat there, and so was the girl on a date with. And we're not talking to each other, but something holding my hands at best when the movie got excited, and then something bit me in the leg. It was a little sting, and then I looked down, but there was nothing. I tried looking to the adjacent seat, but there was nothing either. But then 3 rows down, a woman screamed and she yelled, "There's a snake! There's a snake in here!" And then everybody laughed, thinking that maybe she loves the movie too much since the movie was Snakes on a Plane. And then a man 4 rows down yelled, "There's a snake here, it just bit me. It just bit me in the leg." And then some of them across the hall spotted one in the corner and they yelled, "There are more than one snake in here. Everybody get out. There are a lot of snakes in here." And then there was a panic all around. And then I saw it. A black-colored snake hiding in the darkness of the seat, and it slithered. But this time, I was able to make it out. And I held the girl and told her to jump on the seat, and everyone was over their seats right now, and some were running towards the exit in the panic, all while the film was going on. And then we had no choice but to stop the show. They put on the lights, and there it was, almost 6 to 7 snakes, and there were people panicking because a lot of them were bitten. The snake wranglers were all called in, and everybody was in the state of panic as the police and the ambulance arrived along with the snake wranglers. Luckily, no snake was venomous, and everybody would be all right. And then, they told it is the work of someone who knows snakes. Upon further investigation, it came out that one of the guys in the same show as us had released the snakes, and himself was the snake expert. And he did this in protest of the film. He thought it showed snakes in bad position. Well, his feelings might have been in the right place. What he did was completely wrong, and he got punished for what he did, and rightfully so. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. I went on a date with a Hinge guy once, who right in the middle of it said he had to stop off at his apartment because he forgot his wallet. This is as we're inexplicably moving from one coffee shop to another one that just happened to be on the same route as his apartment. He asked me if I wanted to come inside, just in case he's searching for a while, and since he's been perfectly nice and non-threatening so far, I didn't see any reason not to. Then as we get into his TV room, he ends up pulling me down onto his beanbag and trying to make out with me. He didn't do it a super aggressive way, so much as he was like trying to be sexy, who was not. Then I called him out on it. He said he was just messing around, but I was so turned off at that point that I ended up just getting up and walking home a few minutes later. He texted me a few times trying to apologize and assure me that it was a joke, but I don't know. It was so cringy that I just couldn't get past it. Fast forward to a year later, and I had read on the local news site that he was arrested on suspicion of killing and assaulting of a woman after the woman that he had been on a date with complained to the police that he had held her up against her will. Apparently, when she tried to leave, he held her captive in his apartment and beat her and assaulted her. He could have faced life in prison, but after just 6 years in prison, he might actually get out this year if parole goes well. 6 years. He should be in prison for the rest of his life, and sometimes I wonder how close I came to being the one tied up in his basement. Bumble. No offense to anyone who's had success on it, but the app is cursed for me now. I went on a date with a guy who looked like a Disney prince who grew up in a bad neighborhood. Swear to God, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen and was almost covered in tattoos. I wasn't even surprised when he said he had been in the county jail for 18 months after some BS where a guy got stabbed. That's his quote. I know, giant red flag, but I didn't even care. This guy was so hot, and with my logic of, well, the justice system in this country is screwed, I was good to go. Anyway, we met for drinks. He was nice, paid for everything, the perfect gentleman. He seemed particularly interested in me to lots of guys will literally only talk about themselves on a date, which is the most annoying thing ever been. This guy was all like, "What are you into? Where do you go to school? Blah, blah, blah." Eventually, I got into telling him how I play classical guitar and about the handful of concert performances I'd taken part of during college. I still play an awful lot, but it's more gypsy jazz these days than Montolo Sinclair. That being said, I'm real passionate about flow meat, so my maternal grandmother is from Spain, so I think it's just in my blood. Anyway, when he said your passion is captivating or something like that, I just about melted. He seemed really impressed that I'm somewhat musical person, and I'll be honest, when I say I kind of milked that after that conversation moved on to different things. More drinks came, and as we gradually got drunker, the conversation got a little faster and looser. At the end of our date, he's walking me to my Uber, and I'm debating whether or not to kiss him before I leave when he comes out with, "If I wanted to always remember me, break your ring finger." You know, because they don't heal well. And then you'll have think of me when playing in some of what my brain for a second. And when I look at him like, he laughed and kind of made out like he was kidding. But it was in an almost the exact same way as when an ex had told me I had fat thighs, then tried to retract it when I got upset. It was totally in that I totally meant it. And I'll pretend I'm kidding, since it made me look like a psychopath kind of way. I gave him the benefit of the doubt at first, but he'd also made my mind for me above whether or not I was going to make out with him a resounding no, I can assure you. I told him I'd see him again, and I think actually meant it at first. But over the next few days, mulling it over and telling girlfriends about it made me realize that this guy was not good for me. In fact, hinting at violent tendencies, having already been to jail over a stabbing, these were ginormous red flags, and if I ignored them, well, I was putting my life on the line. So I just kind of ghosted the guy, didn't delete his contact or anything, just kind of kept him on the back burner just in case he changed my mind on it. Now there's a Facebook group for girls in my town, and if one of us is assaulted or roughed up on a date or just while drinking for whatever reason, we can go to the Facebook group and warn other girls about it. Now, please don't go thinking it's some horde witch hunting thing. There's no mob online justice that goes on. Our priority is liaising with state police departments to see that predators are actually dealt with. Not a week goes by since my date with this guy, and a new post starts trending in that group. Whenever a post gets traction like that, it's usually when something bad has happened in the form of an assault, but sometimes it's when something good happens, like when a predator gets heated into jail. That time, it was something bad, really bad, and then affected me personally. A girl had screenshotted a guy's Tinder profile and uploaded it to the group, along with a story about how he'd said the creepiest stuff on her date with her. When she wouldn't go back to his place, he got handsy and eventually hit her when she'd called him some unsavory names over it. It was my jailhouse Disney prince, and that could have been me getting beat in some Walgreens parking lot. The cops got a hold of the guy and he went right back to jail for breaching probation. Only he wasn't on probation for anything like a stabbing incident. It was indecent assault that he'd been convicted of. No kidding, huh? Girls don't ignore red flags. And if a guy mentions being in trouble with the cops, there are ways that you can find out about what. A lot of court documents are available for public viewing after a certain date. So I'm serious when I say that you can look your date up to make sure he's not been on the wrong side being a messed up pervert. Be safe, sisters. Always.
Junko Furuta was born in Misato, Saitama Prefecture on January 18, 1971. She lived at home with her parents and her two brothers, one elder and one younger, and could often be found watching her favorite drama series, Tambu, whenever she wasn't studying. During her teenage years, she attended the Yoshio Minama High School and had a part-time job during after-school hours at a plastic molding factory. It was this job that helped her gain enough experience to be offered at an electronics retailer where she planned on working after she graduated from high school. She was also offered the job because of her almost flawless academic performance. She had an extremely high grades and very infrequent absences. She also saved up money from a part-time job so that she could go on a post-graduation celebration trip around the Japanese home islands. But Junko would never get to go on this trip, as she was about to have a hellish encounter with members of the Japanese criminal organization known as Yakuza. On November 25, 1988, a teenage boy named Hiroshi Miyano, joined by his friend Nobuhiro Manuta, was wandering around his hometown village of Masato with mischief on his mind. It was then that they spotted Junko riding her bike home after finishing her shift at the plastic molding factory. Together, they hatched a devious scheme. Nobuhiro suddenly gave chase and kicked Junko off her bike before being chased away by Hiroshi, who acted as the Good Samaritan and offered to walk her home in safety. The whole thing was a ruse disguised to win her trust, and it worked like a charm. Junko accepted the offer and followed Hiroshi, who said he knew a shortcut to the neighborhood she lived in. But unbeknownst to her, Hiroshi was leading her to a nearby warehouse, and once he let her inside, he told her he was a member of one of the world's most feared criminal organizations, the Yakuza. Hiroshi then told Junko that if she did not do everything she was told, he would have her killed. He then indecently assaulted her in the warehouse, then again in a nearby hotel, with Junko so terrified that she did not want to raise a peep to anyone she saw as they walked between the two places. While they were at the hotel, Hiroshi called his friends from the telephone there, bragging to them that he had procured his own personal plaything. The group of friends had a history of kidnapping girls and carnally attacking them, so his friends pleaded with him to share his new prize. Sickeningly, Hiroshi agreed. Just before 3 a.m. the following morning, Hiroshi forced Junko to follow him to a local park, where 3 friends of his were waiting for them. The boys went through Junko's belongings, finding that her home address was written on one of her notebooks. Now they had the ultimate leverage over her, claiming that if she disobeyed or tried to escape, a team of Yakuza hitmen would murder her mother, father, and brothers in the family home. Junko was then taken to an empty house owned by Nobuhiro's parents, where each of the boys took turns beating and defiling her. Junko believed every word of the boys' threat and took each beating without complaint, purely out of the love for her family, who by this point are becoming extremely concerned about her absence. On November 27th, Junko's parents contacted the police regarding her disappearance. Word went around town that she was missing, word that soon reached the boys who kidnapped her. They argued over letting her go or killing her and disposing of the body. And so one of the boys came up with an appalling, shrewd plan. With the same threats of having her family killed, they made Junko call her parents by phone, telling them she had run away, but was safe with friends and that the police should stop investigating her whereabouts. Whenever Nobuhiro's parents came over to check on their son, Hiroshi forced Junko to act like his girlfriend. But since Nobuhiro's parents were well aware of Hiroshi's status as a Yakuza and were terrified of him, it wasn't a pretense he had kept up for long. Nobuhiro's brother also seemed to be aware that Junko was being held captive and did absolutely nothing about it out of fear of the Yakuza reprisal. Junko was kept as a Yakuza prisoner for over 40 days and nights, and over the course of this period she was beaten, tortured, indecently assaulted by more than 100 other Yakuza members that Hiroshi had invited over. They starved her, hung her from the ceiling, and used her as a human punching bag. They dropped barbells onto her stomach, forced her to eat live cockroaches, and drink her own urine. She was also forced to dance and sing songs while being beaten before forced to commit numerous lewd acts. On some occasions, she was cut open and objects were inserted into the wounds, some of which included a lit light bulb and ignited fireworks. Junko was burned with cigarettes and lighters, and hot wax was stripped onto her eyelids to seal them shut. The boys also tore off her left nipple with pliers and pierced her breast with sewing needles. Whenever she passed out from the pain, the boys dumped her head in a bucket of cold water that kept her at the ready, keeping her awake so that the torture could continue. By the end of 40 days, Junko had been beaten so hard and for so long that her face was almost unrecognizable. And as a result of the repeated violations, she had become pregnant. 16 days into Junko's ordeal, Horishi invited a boy named Koichi Ihara around to the house. Koichi postured as a tough young prospective Yakuza, but was actually horrified by what he saw, how Junko was being treated. When it was his turn to violate her, Koichi found that he didn't have it in him to commit such an atrocious act. He was mocked by the other boys who bullied him into going through with it, questioning his masculinity and telling him that if he didn't assault her, that he would be kept prisoner too, doomed to suffer similar treatment. Traumatized by what he'd seen and racked with guilt over the things he'd done, Koichi confessed his crimes to his brother as soon as he arrived back at his home. The police were soon contacted, and 2 officers were dispatched to the house where Junko was being kept a prisoner. When they arrived at the address, Hiroshi and Nobuhiro played dumb, acting outraged that such an accusation had been made. They even had the gall to invite the officers inside to take a look around, calling their bluff in a way that seemed absolutely outrageous in retrospect. To the police officers, the invitation was all the proof they needed to believe that the 2 boys were telling the truth and that there were no crimes being committed inside the house. If they had bothered to search, Junko would still be alive today, as it is widely accepted that despite some serious mental trauma, she would have recovered from the wounds inflicted on her and gone on to live something of a relatively normal life. But as the month of December rolled around, Junko actually found the courage to sneak downstairs to the telephone to call the police. But to her horror, Hiroshi discovered her trying to summon help, smacking her away from the phone and slamming the headset down into the receiver. When the police dispatcher called back, Hiroshi apologized, informed them that the call was an accident, and told the police not to worry. Hiroshi was furious that Junko had attempted to contact the police and savagely beat her as punishment for the perceived offense. At one point during this particularly savage assault, Hiroshi doused Junko's legs with lighter fluid and set them on fire. Junko was in so much pain that she actually started having a seizure, but the boys believed she was faking it to gain sympathy and set her legs on fire all over again. It was about this point in her captivity that Junko reportedly asked her captors to kill her so that her suffering might be over with, but they mocked her for this request and refused, thinking of more imaginative ways to torture her, such as forcing her to sleep outside at night when temperatures would dip below zero. Somehow, despite being on the verge of death, Junko didn't die of hypothermia. But by the time the torture got that severe, it was having a catastrophic effect on her body. Weeks of abuse had caused Junko to lose control of her bladder and bowels, but she was only beaten harder when she urinated on the floor. She was also rendered incapable of drinking water or consuming food, and would vomit profusely after each attempt. But again, instead of slowing down or attempting medical aid, Hiroshi and his minions only beat her harder from making a mess. Such sustained beatings and torture also had a horrific effect on her personal appearance too. Her face became so swollen that she barely resembled a human being anymore, and her body was so crippled and affected from untreated wounds that she started giving off a sickly, rotting scent that caused Hiroshi and his friends to lose any kind of carnal interest in her. On January 4th, 1989, after a humiliating loss during a game of mahjong, Hiroshi hurried to take his frustrations out on Junko. Taking place over the course of 2 hours. This was perhaps the most brutal, sustained, and cruel beating that she had ever been subjected to, and the details are honestly not worth going into. Given how vile the previous assaults on Junko were, you can imagine how despicable this last one was, and as a result, Junko finally succumbed to her wounds and died later that day. When the boys discovered that she was dead, they wrapped her body in bed sheets and stuffed what remained of her into a travel bag. They then shoved her body into a 55-gallon drum and poured wet concrete into it, driving the drum out into a suburb of Tokyo before dumping it in a secluded area. A few weeks later, on January 23rd, Hiroshi was visited by Japanese police officers and arrested. But as it turns out, this is for an assault on a different girl than Junko, one that had occurred back in December of the previous year. The officers didn't bluff Hiroshi into thinking that they knew he committed more serious crimes, and out of the blue, he suddenly confessed to the killing of Junko and told them where they could find her body. Horrified by the impromptu confession, the police drove out to the secluded spot that Hiroshi had described and found the steel drum that contained Junko's body. Her hands were so badly burned that she couldn't be identified by her fingerprints. So many of her teeth had been knocked out that the police initially didn't think she could be identified by her dental records. But a partial match turned out to be enough to confirm that the body did in fact belong to the missing Junko Furuta. In light of the fact that they were juveniles at the time of the offense, the identities of all those confirmed were kept a closely guarded secret by the Japanese courts. However, outraged by the severity of the crime, journalists worked hard to uncover their names and subsequently published them in the national newspapers. The reasoning was that no one who could commit such horrific acts of carnal violence deserved to remain anonymous, and that they should be named and shamed for the horrendous things they've done. Not only did Hiroshi Miyano deny that he'd actually murdered Junko, only pleading guilty to the crime of committing bodily injury that resulted in death, but when he was finally convicted of murder in July of 1990, he actually appealed the sentence. Appalled by such a juvenile and cowardly display from Hiroshi, Tokyo's High Court Judge Ryuichi Yanase not only denied the appeal, but gave Hiroshi an additional 3 years on top of his original 17, publicly scolding him for his apparent lack of remorse. During Hiroshi's trial, the High Court judge commented that exceptionally grave and atrocious violence had been inflicted upon the victim, and that Junko Furuta had been murdered so brutally that her soul must be wandering in torment. Upon hearing the details of the brutal assault and torture that ended her life, a spectator in the gallery actually passed out from the shock. Junko's mother also reportedly had a complete mental breakdown when she learned of her daughter's treatment, which required intense psychiatric treatment to overcome. Hiroshi's parents were so ashamed by the whole ordeal that they sold their home and donated the fee of almost $500,000 to Junko's mother and father. Junko's funeral was held on April 2nd, 1989. One of her friends read a memorial piece that stated, "Jun-san, welcome back. I have never dreamed that we would see you again in this way. He must have been in so much pain. There must have been so much suffering. The traditional coat we all made for the school festival looked really good on you. We will never forget you. I have heard that the headmaster has presented you with a graduation certificate. So we graduate together. All of us. Jun-chan, there is no more pain for you now. No more suffering. Please rest in peace." The electronics retailer that was due to give Junko a job upon graduation presented her parents with a uniform that she would have worn during her employment, along with sincere condolences. They placed the uniform in her casket, saying it's what she would have wanted, given how proud she was that she'd secured such a prestigious position at such a young age. What happened to her is something that the Yakuza subject young women to far more regularly than will ever be publicized. You get that the Yakuza are still romanticized in a similar way of how the Italian-American mob had been idealized in the past. We must be cautious not to put criminal organizations on the pedestal, and we must be quick to remember that it might have been our own sisters or daughters that were subjected to such horrendous treatment by men who saw Junko little more than an object that he toyed with, then disposed of. May she and all of the victims of wanton criminal violence obtain the peace and death that was denied to them in life.